In October 1888, a man painted his bedroom. Not a cathedral, not a king, not a landscape that would make tourists weep, just a room. A small room in the south of France with a wooden bed, 2 chairs, and a window with the shutters closed against the afternoon sun. He was so captivated by this image, this ordinary, unremarkable image, that he painted it 3 times. 3 separate canvases of the same bed, the same chairs, the same closed shutters, as if he was trying to capture something that kept slipping away. That man was Vincent van Gogh. He decided to become a painter at 27 years old, an age when most artists have already found their style, their audience, their place in the world. Van Gogh was just beginning, starting from nothing, starting from less than nothing. He was dead by 37, 10 years. That's the entire window. A decade to go from a man who couldn't draw a convincing hand to the name that people think of before any other name when they hear the word artist. But why this bedroom? Of all the images he created, and there were hundreds, nearly 1,000, why did he keep returning to this simple room? What was he looking for in those 4 walls that he couldn't find anywhere else? To understand that, we have to unlearn almost everything we think we know about Van Gogh. Because the story you've heard, the one about the mad genius and the severed ear, isn't just incomplete. It's almost entirely backwards. Here's the version you probably know. Vincent van Gogh, a mad genius, tormented by demons only he could see. A man who painted with the fever of insanity, who saw swirling skies and blazing suns that existed nowhere but in his fractured mind. He cut off his own ear in a fit of passion. He shot himself in a wheat field. He died penniless, unknown, appreciated only after it was too late. It's a beautiful story, tragic and romantic in all the right ways. The kind of narrative that makes people nod knowingly and say, "Ah, yes, that's the price of genius. That's what it costs to see what others cannot see. The suffering artist, the tortured soul, the man who burned so bright, he had to burn out." There's just one problem with this story. It's mostly fiction, not the facts. The facts are real. He did cut off part of his ear, though probably not for the reasons you've heard. He did spend time in an asylum. He did die young, from a gunshot wound that may or may not have been self-inflicted. The events happened. But the interpretation, the idea that his madness was somehow the source of his genius, that his mental illness fueled his art, that he painted because he was broken, that's not just wrong. It's the exact opposite of what actually happened. Van Gogh didn't create because of his mental illness. He created despite it, often directly against it. His art wasn't an expression of madness. It was a weapon he used to fight it. And that bedroom, that simple, carefully arranged room that he painted 3 times, wasn't a window into chaos. It was the opposite. It was an anchor, a declaration of sanity in the middle of a storm that never stopped. To see how that's true, we need to go back. Back before the paintings. Back before the yellow. Back to a man who had failed at everything he'd ever tried.
Before Vincent van Gogh ever picked up a paintbrush, he spent years trying to find a purpose. Some reason to exist. Some way to matter. He worked at an art dealership, his uncle's business, a respectable position. He was fired. Not for incompetence, but for something worse. He kept telling wealthy customers that their taste in art was terrible. He tried teaching at a boarding school in England. That didn't last. He studied theology in Amsterdam, hoping to become a minister like his father. He failed the entrance examination, tried again through an easier program, failed that too. Then came the Borinage, a coal mining region in Belgium where workers lived in conditions that most of Europe preferred not to think about. Vincent went there as a missionary to preach to the miners, and he took the job seriously, more seriously than anyone expected. He gave away his clothes to families who had less. He slept on the floor because beds felt like luxuries he hadn't earned. He descended into the mines himself, saw the darkness that these men lived in, and came back up, changed. The church dismissed him. He was too intense, they said, too extreme. He'd taken the message of Christian poverty a bit too literally for their comfort. By his mid-20s, Vincent van Gogh had tried and failed at nearly everything a respectable Dutch family would have wanted for their son. His father, a pastor himself, began to worry that Vincent might be mentally unwell. His siblings kept their distance. He was becoming, in the eyes of everyone who knew him, an embarrassment. Here's something worth considering. At the exact moment Vincent van Gogh was learning how to draw, badly, an artist named William Adolphe Bouguereau was the most celebrated painter in France. His canvases sold for fortunes. Critics praised his technical perfection. Wealthy collectors competed for his work. Quick question: when was the last time you saw a Bouguereau poster on a college dorm wall? When was the last time someone got a Bouguereau tattoo? Success in the moment, it turns out, is a terrible predictor of significance across time. The artists who win their era often lose history, and the ones who lose their era sometimes win everything that comes after. At 27, with nothing left to try, Vincent made a decision that looked like surrender. He would become an artist. He had no training, no connections, no particular evidence of talent. He couldn't even draw hands properly. They came out looking like bunches of bananas. But he had one thing: a desperate, almost frightening need to do something that felt true. His early paintings reflect this. Look at them and you'll see someone learning in public, failing on canvas. The colors are muddy, browns and grays, and the kind of dark greens that suggest mold. The figures are stiff. The compositions are awkward. But there's something else there if you look closely. An obsession with a particular kind of subject. Not the wealthy, not the beautiful, not the powerful. Van Gogh was drawn to workers, peasants, miners, weavers hunched over looms in dark rooms. The people who broke their bodies to survive and had nothing to show for it but broken bodies. In 1885, after years of practice, he created what he considered his first real painting, The Potato Eaters. It shows a peasant family, 5 figures, gathered around a table in near darkness, eating potatoes by the light of a single oil lamp. Their faces are rough, almost ugly if you're being honest. Bony, weathered, prematurely aged, the kind of faces that respectable society preferred not to look at directly. He wrote to his brother Theo about this painting. I wanted to convey the idea that these people, eating their potatoes by the light of their little lamp, have dug the earth with the very hands they are putting into the dish. That it speaks of manual labor, and that they have honestly earned their food. Notice what he's saying. The potatoes aren't just dinner, they're evidence, proof of labor, a life earned by hands that knew the weight of soil. Van Gogh wasn't interested in beauty as the art world defined it. He wanted truth. And truth, he believed, lived closer to dirt than to marble. His brother Theo, who had become an art dealer in Paris, looked at the potato eaters and offered some honest feedback. The colors are too dark.
The palette is muddy. Nobody wants to hang paintings that feel like they're made of mud. People want light. It wasn't cruel, it was accurate. And it pointed toward a door that Vincent hadn't yet noticed.
And then Vincent van Gogh discovered yellow. Not gradually, the way most artists evolve. Almost violently. After a brief time in Paris, he travelled south to Arles in Provence. And something in that Mediterranean light broke something open in him. Suddenly, yellow was everywhere in his work. Sunflowers blazing like small suns. Wheat fields that seemed to vibrate with heat. Cafe terraces glowing against the night. Even the skin of his portrait subjects took on undertones of gold and ochre, as if the people themselves were lit from within. He rented a building he called the Yellow House, a modest 2-story structure at 2 Place Lamartine. Nothing special to look at, but to Vincent, it represented everything he'd ever wanted. A home, a studio, a place where artists could live and work together, supporting each other through the difficulty of making something from nothing. He called this dream the Studio of the South. And to prepare for it, to make it real, he decorated obsessively. He painted sunflowers for the walls. He arranged furniture. And in October 1888, he painted his bedroom. He described his intentions to Theo. This time, it's simply my bedroom. But the color has to do the job here. And through its simplification, to be suggestive of rest or of sleep in general. In short, looking at the painting should rest the mind, or rather, the imagination. He continued, the walls are pale violet. The bed and chairs are fresh butter yellow. The sheet and pillows very bright lemon green. The blanket scarlet red. The window green. And that's all. Nothing in this room with its closed shutters. The solidity of the furniture should express unshakable repose. Listen to what he's actually saying. This wasn't just documentation. It wasn't a painting of where he slept. It was a prescription. He wanted to create an image so peaceful, so stable, so grounded, that simply looking at it would calm you down. And look at the bed. 2 pillows. Always 2 pillows in every version. Van Gogh, who lived alone, who struggled to maintain relationships, who drove away nearly everyone who tried to get close, painted a bed for 2. He didn't want to be alone. The painting was a wish as much as a room. Which brings us to something we need to talk about directly: the mental illness. Van Gogh was not a wild-eyed visionary seeing beautiful hallucinations. He was a man with a serious psychiatric condition, probably bipolar disorder, possibly complicated by epilepsy or other factors, who experienced devastating episodes that left him unable to function, unable to paint, unable to think clearly, unable to be the artist he was fighting so hard to become. After the incident with his ear, after the breakdown that followed the collapse of his friendship with Gogh, he admitted himself to the asylum at Saint-Rémy. He stayed there for over a year. During that time, he would go weeks, sometimes months, without being able to paint at all. The episode stole everything from him: his clarity, his energy, his sense that anything he did mattered. But here's what the romantic version of the story leaves out. In the windows between those episodes, his productivity was almost superhuman. In roughly 1 year at the asylum, 1 year of battling a disease that wanted him dead, Van Gogh produced nearly 150 paintings, including some of his most famous works, including Starry Night, which wasn't painted in a moment of ecstatic madness,
but in a moment of hard-won clarity, looking through the barred window of a room where he'd been locked for his own protection. Van Gogh didn't paint because of his mental illness. He painted against it. Every brushstroke was an act of defiance, a way of saying, "I'm still here," to a brain that kept insisting he wasn't worth keeping here. The art wasn't a symptom of the disease. It was the treatment. And maybe that's why his work still resonates. Not just with art historians or museum visitors or people who can afford to bid at auction. With everyone. With people who've never held a paintbrush and never will. Because we've all had mornings where getting out of bed felt like an act of war against ourselves. Not because we're artists. Not because we have a diagnosis. Not because something dramatic happened. Just because life, sometimes, feels heavier than it should. Because the distance between the pillow and the floor can feel like the distance between continents. And in those moments, doing anything, making breakfast, answering an email, showing up somewhere you said you'd be, can feel like a quiet act of defiance against a gravity that no one else can see. Van Gogh built an entire body of work in those moments. 900 paintings in 10 years. Most of them created not in bursts of manic inspiration, not in the fever of madness, but in the hard-won spaces between episodes. In the mornings when he could have stayed in bed and didn't. In the afternoons when the light was right and he was just well enough to use it. The bedroom painting wasn't a portrait of madness. It was a portrait of what you build in the spaces where the madness isn't. A room, a chair, a bed, something solid to hold on to when everything else is spinning. Almost everything we know about Van Gogh's inner life, his doubts, his hopes, his understanding of his own work, comes from his letters. He wrote constantly, mostly to Theo. Over 600 letters survive. They're extraordinary documents, intimate, philosophical, sometimes painfully honest about his own failures and limitations. He wrote the way he painted, with intensity, without pretense, as if the act of communication itself was a kind of survival. In one letter, he described himself with a clarity that still cuts. In most people's eyes, what am I? A nobody, an eccentric, an unpleasant person, someone who has no position in society and will never have one. In short, the lowest of the low. Very well. Even if that were true, then I would still want to show through my work what is in the heart of such a nobody, such an eccentric. This is not the voice of a man lost in madness. This is someone with brutal, almost uncomfortable clarity about his own position, and a stubborn refusal to let that clarity stop him from working. When Vincent died at 37, in the summer of 1890, from a gunshot wound whose exact circumstances are still debated, Theo was devastated. He'd spent years supporting his brother financially and emotionally, believing in work that almost no one else would buy. 6 months after Vincent's death, Theo died too. He was only 33. The letters, the hundreds of paintings, the entire legacy of one of the most recognizable artists in human history, all of it passed to Theo's widow, a woman named Johanna. She had never met Vincent in person. She knew him only through letters and through the canvases stacked in her small apartment. But she made a choice. She would spend the rest of her life organizing exhibitions,
translating and publishing the letters, and fighting to make the world see what her husband had seen. Without Johanna van Gogh Bonge, Vincent would be a footnote. A strange Dutch painter who sold one painting in his lifetime and left behind a lot of canvases that no one quite knew what to do with. History is strange that way. The people who ensure immortality are often not the ones who achieve it. But Johanna's work had a cost. By publishing the letters, by telling the story, she helped create the myth as much as the legacy. Van Gogh, the artist who worked, became Van Gogh, the artist who suffered. The paintings became secondary to the biography. The ear became more famous than the hand that held the brush. One version makes you nod at tragedy. The other makes you look at your own hands differently. They're not the same thing. There's a quote that floats around the internet, usually placed next to an image of starry night. It says, "I would rather die of passion than of boredom." It sounds romantic, defiant, the kind of thing you'd tattoo on yourself at 22. And Van Gogh did write something close to those words in a letter to Theo. But if you've been paying attention, really paying attention, you know that's not romantic at all. It's a survival strategy, a man telling himself that if he's going to suffer, and he knows he's going to suffer, he might as well suffer in the direction of something that matters. It's not a celebration of passion, it's a negotiation with pain. Van Gogh wasn't a genius who happened to be troubled. He was troubled. Deeply, sometimes unbearably troubled. And in the spaces where the trouble wasn't, in the mornings when he could get up, in the afternoons when the light was right, in the moments when his mind was his own, he built something that outlasted all of it. Maybe that's the lesson. Not that great art requires suffering. We've told ourselves that story for too long, and it's hurt too many people who believed it. The lesson is simpler and harder. Great art can exist alongside suffering, not because of it, not transformed by it into something beautiful, just alongside, in the spaces, in the gaps. If you're stubborn enough and lucky enough to keep picking up the brush. He painted that bedroom 3 times. Not because he loved the room, not because it was beautiful, but because he needed to believe it existed. A place of rest, a place of peace, a place where the shutters could stay closed and the light would still find a way through.